Welcome to Myths and Slumber. Tonight, we explore the haunting cry of the Banshee, Ireland's ethereal messenger who wails at the threshold between the living and the dead. If ancient myths are your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the ancient stories carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes. Let your body sink gently into the surface beneath you. Feel the weight of the day dissolving, like morning mist over a quiet Irish hillside. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw soften. Let the breath come slowly, naturally, without effort. You are safe here. You are still. You are held in this moment, in this quiet, in this gentle darkness behind your eyes. Tonight, we travel far. We travel across water, across the gray-green Atlantic, where the waves have told their secrets to the rocks for 10,000 years. We travel to an island of ancient memory, where the hills are older than history, where the trees remember things that people have long forgotten. We travel to Ireland. The Ireland of myth and firelight. The Ireland of storytellers who sat in stone-walled cottages while the wind came in off the sea and the flames bent low and the children huddled close. The Ireland where the veil between the living world and the spirit world was said to be no thicker than a breath, no stronger than a spider's thread. Breathe in slowly through your nose. Hold it gently. And breathe out, long and quiet, through your mouth. Tonight, we will hear the story of one of the oldest, most mysterious, most deeply human figures in all of mythology. A figure who stands at the threshold between life and death. A figure who weeps, not because she wishes you harm, but because she knows, she has always known, that love and loss are the same river, flowing to the same dark sea. Let yourself drift now. Let the story carry you. You are safe. You are held. You are listening. Part 1: The Land That Made the Myth. To understand the Banshee, you must first understand the land that gave her breath. Ireland is a small island, roughly the shape of a shield, sitting at the western edge of Europe where the land runs out and the ocean begins. For the ancient people who lived there, people who arrived in waves across thousands of years, the earliest coming perhaps 9,000 years ago, walking across land bridges that the rising seas would later swallow, for all of those people, this island was not merely a place to live. It was a living thing itself. It breathed. It dreamed. It remembered. The landscape of Ireland is one of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary strangeness. There are mountains that sit above the clouds in the west, their stone faces streaked with rain that has been falling since before human memory. There are bogs, vast, dark, silent expanses of peat that have preserved the bodies of the ancient dead for 2,000 years, their faces still wearing expressions of surprise, or peace, or something that we cannot name. There are limestone plains in the center of the island, the Banshee, where the rock is so old and so bare and so etched with cracks that it looks like the surface of another world. And there are forests, or what remains of them, ancient oakwood groves where the light filters green and gold and the silence is so complete you can hear your own heartbeat. And everywhere, woven through the landscape like threads in an ancient cloth, there are monuments of the dead. Newgrange, that great stone mound in County Meath, was built 5,000 years ago, older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids of Egypt. Built so precisely that once a year, on the morning of the winter solstice, A single shaft of sunlight pierces the darkness of its inner chamber and illuminates the carved spirals on its walls. For 18 minutes, the dead and the sun are reunited. For 18 minutes, the boundary between this world and the next is made of light. There are dolmens, massive stone tables balanced on upright supports, the bones of ancient ancestors sleeping beneath them for millennia. There are ring forts, their earthen banks still visible after 2,000 years, the ghosts of houses and hearths and families inside them. There are fairy mounds, called siddhi in the old language, gentle hills that look unremarkable from the outside but were understood, by everyone who lived near them, to be doorways into another world entirely. This is the world in which the Banshee was born. Not born in a single moment, not invented by a single storyteller, but grown gradually from the soil of this island the way the hawthorn grows, slowly, silently, until one day you realize it has always been there, white-flowered and ancient, marking the edge of the known world. The people of early Ireland had a relationship with death that was profoundly different from our own. Death was not a wall. It was a door. The dead did not disappear, they moved into a different layer of existence, a parallel world that was sometimes called Tir na Nog, the land of eternal youth, or the other world, or simply the land beneath the mounds. And the inhabitants of that other world, the gods, the spirits, the dead, they were not gone. They were nearby. They were watching. They were, sometimes, willing to speak. The Irish mythological tradition is one of the richest, most complex, and most beautifully detailed in all of the world's sacred literature. The texts that survive, the Liber Gabála Érenn, the Book of the Taking of Ireland, the mythological cycles, the Ulster cycle, the Fenian cycle, these were written down by Christian monks in the early medieval period, but they preserve stories and beliefs that are far older, stories that had been carried in living memory and oral tradition for centuries or even millennia before the monks set pen to vellum. She is not always called by that name. She appears as a washerwoman at a ford, cleaning the blood-stained armor of those who are about to die in battle. She appears as a beautiful young woman of terrible radiance, offering a hero a cup of sovereignty and foretelling his fate. She appears as an old crone, withered and wild-eyed, whose screaming on the wind is the last sound a man will hear before his world ends. She appears as a deer, as a crow, as a woman combing her hair on the hillside at dusk, her weeping carrying across the valley in the still evening air. She has been feared for 1,000 years. She has been respected for longer. And she has been misunderstood, perhaps, for all of that time. She is the one who cries when no one else can. She is the one who knows before you know. She is the sound the world makes when it loses something that cannot be replaced. Let us go deeper now. Let us go back to the very beginning of the Irish mythological world, to understand where she came from, and why she matters, and why the memory of her has persisted across centuries and oceans and the terrible weight of history. Let us begin. Part 2, the Tuatha Dé Danann, the Divine Ancestors. In the beginning, according to the ancient Irish texts, there were several races of beings who came to Ireland before the people we would recognize as Irish. These races, mysterious, powerful, sometimes monstrous, sometimes luminously beautiful, were the original inhabitants of the island, and their stories form the deep foundation of all Irish mythology. The most important of these races, the ones whose gods and goddesses and heroes populate the majority of Irish myth, were called the Tuatha Dé Danann. The name is usually translated as the people, or tribes, of the goddess Danu, though the figure of Danu herself is curiously absent from the surviving texts, as if she were so ancient, so fundamental, that even the mythmakers could not quite remember her face. The Tuatha De Danann were beings of extraordinary power and beauty. They came to Ireland, the texts say, from the northern islands of the world, from 4 mythical cities whose names were Phaelius, Gorias, Murias, and Phineas. From each of these cities they brought a sacred treasure. From Phaelius, the Lea Phael, the stone of destiny, which cried out beneath the feet of the rightful king of Ireland. From Gorias, the spear of Luff, which could not be stayed in battle once it was thrown. From Murias, the cauldron of the Dagda, which could feed all who came to it and from which no one ever went away hungry. From Phineas, the sword of light, which was unbeatable in battle and from which no one could escape. These were not merely objects. They were expressions of the Tuatha De Danann themselves, their wisdom, their power, their generosity, their invincibility. And the Tuatha De themselves were expressions of something older still, the forces of nature, the cycles of the land, the deep grammar of existence that the ancient Irish perceived in everything around them. Among the Tuatha De Danann, there were gods of skill and craft, Luff of the long arm, master of every art, whose name is preserved in the harvest festival of Lugnasad. There was the Dagda, the good god, vast and powerful and earthy, whose club could kill 9 men with one end and restore the dead to life with the other. There was Manannan Mac Lyre, lord of the sea and keeper of the otherworld, who rode across the waves on a chariot of white foam and whose cloak of mists could make himself or anyone invisible. And there were the goddesses. This is important. The goddesses of the Tuatha De Danann were often more complex, more dangerous, more layered than their male counterparts. Because Ireland was, at its deepest mythological level, a land whose sovereignty was feminine. The land itself was a goddess, she was Eriu, whose name became Ireland, Bamba, Fodla, and the right to rule her was granted not by conquest alone but by sacred marriage with the land's divine feminine spirit. It is from this tradition of powerful, liminal, sovereignty-linked goddesses that the Banshee most directly descends. Let us speak of some of them. Let us speak of the Morrigan first, because she is perhaps the most ancient and the most important. The Morrigan, whose name may mean Great Queen or Phantom Queen, was a goddess of fate, battle, death, and transformation. She was not a goddess of war in the simple sense of enjoying violence. She was something more fundamental than that. She was the principle of inevitable fate. She was the force that determined, before the first sword was raised, who would live and who would die. She moved across battlefields in the form of a crow, perching on the shoulder of the dying, watching the last breath leave the body with eyes that held neither cruelty nor comfort, only knowing. The Morrigan was triple in nature, as many of the great Irish goddesses were. She was 3 in 1, Bad, whose name meant crow or battle crow, who prophesied doom and flew above armies in battle, Macha, who was connected to the land, to sovereignty, to the endurance of suffering, to the horses that ran across Irish plains in the early morning, and sometimes the third aspect was called Nemain, frenzy or panic, the terror that seized warriors in battle and made their limbs give way. Together, they were the Morrigan. The great queen of fate. The watcher at the threshold of death. And it is in Bab, in particular, that we find one of the most direct ancestors of the Banshee. Bab, sometimes described as Bab Catha, the battle crow, appeared at fords and rivers on the night before great battles, washing the blood-stained clothing and armor of those who were doomed to die. She was called the washerwoman at the ford, the washing woman, the being nigh in Scottish tradition, where the same belief persisted across the sea. If you came upon her at her washing, at the edge of dark water, in the grey light before dawn, you knew. You knew without being told. The garments in her hands were yours. This is one of the oldest threads in the tapestry of the Banshee. The idea that a supernatural feminine being knows the fate of the dying before they themselves know it. That she mourns them before they are dead. That her grief is not for herself but for them, and for the living who will be left behind. Now let us speak of another goddess, equally important, equally ancient. Let us speak of Brigid. Brigid, daughter of the Dagda, one of the most beloved figures in all of Irish mythology, was a goddess of fire, healing, poetry, and smithcraft. She was warmth and light. She was the first dawn of spring after winter's darkness. She was the keeper of the sacred flame at Kildare, which her priestesses tended for centuries, and which the Christian tradition eventually folded into the legend of Saint Brigid, keeping the fire and the tenderness and the protective feminine power alive under a different name. But Brigid, the warm and the gentle, is also credited in the mythological tradition with one of the most significant acts in the whole history of Irish funerary culture. When her son Ruadhan was killed in battle, killed fighting against the Tuatha De Danann themselves, caught between two warring peoples, Brigid came to the battlefield and she did something that had never been done before. She keened. The word keening, from the Irish ceoined, meaning crying, lamenting, describes a particular kind of ritualized vocal mourning. It is a wailing, a crying, a singing of grief that pours from the body like something that cannot be contained. It is grief-given sound. And according to the mythology, it was Brigid who first made this sound. Who opened her mouth on the battlefield where her son lay dead and let the sound of her sorrow pour out of her, uncontrolled and enormous, into the air of Ireland. The Banshee is the supernatural echo of this tradition. She is the divine keener. She is the one who weeps before the death occurs, so that the grief is already woven into the air around the dying person, so that when the moment comes, the universe has already acknowledged what is being lost. There is a tenderness in this, if you hold it gently and look at it without fear. There is another figure we must mention before we leave the divine ancestors, Eowyn. Or sometimes Ain, the goddess of the summer sun, of love, of sovereignty in Munster, who was said to manifest on midsummer nights at the hill of Knockcaney in County Limerick, dancing among her followers with a light that made the grain grow and the cattle thrive. Ain was one of those goddesses who straddled the line between the divine world and the human world. She loved mortals, she sometimes lay with them, she gave them gifts and sometimes she grieved for them. And there is Cleodna, pronounced something like Cleena, the queen of the Munster fairies, one of the most beautiful beings ever described in Irish myth, who was associated with the waves of the sea, with the soul's passage to the other world, and with a particular, haunting kind of presence at the edges of the mortal world. She too wore the face of the keening woman sometimes. She too knew when a life was ending. All of these figures, the Morrigan, Bab, Brigid, Ain, Cleodna, are threads in the same weaving. They are the divine feminine of ancient Ireland in all its aspects, sovereign and prophetic, tender and terrible, creative and destructive, life-giving and death-acknowledging. And from all of them, woven together across centuries of storytelling, the figure of the Banshee was gradually formed. Part 3, Her Name and Her Nature. The word banshee comes to us from the Irish, bean sidhe. Bean, a woman. Sidhe, of the fairy mound, of the otherworld, of the spirit world beneath the hills. Woman of the otherworld. Woman of the fairy mound. Woman who lives between this world and the next. It is important to understand what the word sidhe means, because it holds within itself the entire cosmology that makes the banshee possible. The sidhe, pronounced shee, were the fairy mounds of Ireland. They were the hills and mounds in the landscape that were understood to be the dwelling places of the Tuatha De Danann, the divine beings who had ruled Ireland before the coming of the Gaels. According to the mythological tradition, when the Gaels arrived and defeated the Tuatha De Danann in battle, the divine beings did not simply disappear. They went underground. They retreated into the hills and mounds and beneath the lakes, into a parallel world that occupied the same space as the human world but at a different frequency, a different depth. The otherworld was not somewhere else. It was right here, just slightly out of reach, just slightly out of sight. The sidhe, then, are not merely hills. They are doorways. They are the places where the membrane between the worlds is thin enough to touch. And the beings who live within them, the Tuatha De who retreated there, the fairy folk, the sidhe, people of the mound, they are not entirely gone from the human world. They can be heard. They can, occasionally, be seen. And they can, at certain moments and in certain circumstances, make themselves known. The bean sidhe is one of those moments of knowing. She is the point at which the otherworld reaches through the membrane and touches the human world, not to harm it but to acknowledge it. To say, I see you. I know what is happening. I grieve with you. In the earliest forms of the tradition, the banshee was understood to be a spirit who was attached not to a place but to a family. Specifically, she was attached to the great families of Ireland, the ancient noble families, the clans who traced their ancestry back to the heroes of the mythological cycles, back to the kings and warriors who had shaped the island's history. She was their spirit mourner. Their ancestral keener. The feminine divine face of their family's fate. The families she was most traditionally associated with were those whose names began with O or Mac, the old Gaelic clan structures. The O'Briens of Munster, descendants of the great High King Brian Boru. The O'Neills of Ulster, one of the most ancient and powerful clans in the whole of Ireland. The O'Concabares, the Connors. The Kavanaghs of Leinster. These were not simply families. They were living continuations of the mythological lineages, and the spirit that mourned their dead was understood to have been with them from the very beginning of their line, as faithful and as inevitable as the family name itself. Over time, as the tradition evolved and spread and was reinterpreted through different regions and different centuries, the banshee's attachment became broader. Any family of Irish origin might have their own banshee. Any household where Irish blood ran deep might hear, on the right kind of night, the sound of her weeping in the air outside the window, in the valley below the house, in the space between the wind and the silence. Now let us speak of her appearance, because this is where the tradition becomes wonderfully complex. The banshee does not have a single face. She has many. And the variation in how she looks says something profound about the nature of grief itself, which also does not have a single face. In some accounts, she is young. Heartbreakingly young, and beautiful in the way that the Irish mythological tradition describes the women of the otherworld, luminous, slightly too perfect, with eyes of a color you cannot quite name and hair that moves as if it is always in wind. She wears white, or sometimes grey, or sometimes a green cloak that is the color of Ireland's hills in the rain. She sits on a stone or on the hillside or at the edge of a stream, and she combs her hair. This detail recurs again and again, with a silver or golden comb, and she weeps. Her weeping is not ugly. It is the most beautiful and the most terrible sound you have ever heard. It is the sound of something vast and irreplaceable passing out of the world. In other accounts, she is old. Old as the land itself. Bent and small and wrapped in rags or cloaks the color of storm clouds. Her face is the face of extreme age, lined and hollowed, but her eyes are bright and deep and hold within them something that is not human at all. Her weeping in this form is different, harsher, wilder, more like the scream of the wind through stone walls on a winter night. More like the sound that comes from a throat that has been weeping for 1,000 years and has moved beyond sorrow into something rawer and more elemental. These two aspects, the young and the old, echo the traditions of the divine feminine throughout Celtic mythology. The goddess in her maiden aspect and her crone aspect. The promise of life and the recognition of death. The banshee who appears as a young woman may be seen as connected to the sovereignty goddesses, the ones who embodied the living vitality of the land. The banshee who appears as a crone is more directly connected to the washerwoman at the ford, to the figure of death as an ancient and exhausted keeper of terrible knowledge. There is sometimes a third form. A woman of middle age, not young, not old, but caught in the fullness of her power, wearing a grey cloak and a red skirt, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face not quite turned toward you, always somehow seen from an angle, always somehow at the edge of what can be clearly perceived. This form carries something of the Morrigan's energy, purposeful, composed, utterly certain of what she knows. The color of the banshee's clothing also carries meaning. White is the color of the otherworld in Celtic tradition, not the sterile white of modernity but the luminous white of mist and moonlight, the white of the swan on the dark water, the white of something that exists at the edge of the visible. Green is the color of the land itself, of Ireland, of the sovereignty of the earth. Grey is the color of the threshold, the in-between, the liminal space where neither world fully claims you. Red, when it appears, in skirts or in hair, carries the ancient association with the sacred feminine, with blood, with the life force itself in its most potent and most dangerous form. And the comb. Let us speak of the comb, because this detail appears so persistently that it must hold something important. Across the Irish tradition, one of the great dangers associated with the banshee was this: if you found the comb she had left behind, you must not pick it up. To pick up the banshee's comb was to invite her to come for you directly, to invite her touch, to open yourself to the full force of whatever she carried. The comb was her instrument, her attribute, an extension of herself. And like all things belonging to the otherworld, it was beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The comb in many world mythologies is associated with death. Mermaids, who are also liminal feminine figures connected to water and death and transformation, carry combs. The act of combing the hair is a preparation, for sleep, for ritual, for the journey into death. To comb the hair of the dead is a final act of tenderness. The banshee combing her own hair while she weeps may be understood as a perpetual preparation, a continuous ritual of readiness, a beautiful and sorrowful act of acknowledgement that passage is always occurring, that the boundary is always being crossed somewhere, that she is always both arriving and departing. Part 4, The Sound, the Caoined. There is no aspect of the Banshee tradition more consistently described, more universally agreed upon, more viscerally remembered by those who encountered it or claimed to encounter it, than the sound she made. The Caoined. The keen. The wail. Some described it as beginning low, almost inaudible at first, a vibration at the edge of hearing, something you might dismiss as the wind if you were not listening carefully. But the Banshee's keen always grew. It moved through registers, from low and mournful to high and piercing, like a song that was also a scream, like weeping that had broken through into something beyond weeping. Lady Wilde, Jane Francesca Wilde, mother of Oscar Wilde, who published an extraordinary collection of Irish folklore in the late 19th century under the title Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland, described the cry of the Banshee as being like the sound of the wind in the trees mixed with the wail of a woman whose grief has passed beyond all comfort. She wrote of witnesses who heard the sound and could not move, not from fear exactly, but from a kind of recognition, as if the sound had reached something very deep in them and pressed on it, and they were held there, motionless, while the sorrow passed through them like water through soil. This practice was old. Extraordinarily old. Traces of ritual wailing at death have been found in human cultures across the world since the earliest evidence of deliberate burial, which is to say, since the earliest evidence of human beings understanding that death means something, that the person who was here yesterday and is not here today deserves acknowledgement, deserves mourning, deserves the sound of the living world grieving their absence. In Ireland, keening survived as a living practice well into the 19th century and in some isolated areas into the early 20th century. The Catholic Church had mixed feelings about it. It was too old, too pagan, too much of the earth and not enough of the scripture. But the people kept doing it because it answered something in them that scripture, however beautiful, could not quite reach. It answered the need to make sound in the face of loss. It answered the need to let the body participate in grief, not just the mind. This is why the sound was so overwhelming to those who heard it. It was not just one person's grief. It was all grief, for all time, given sound for a few terrible and beautiful minutes in the middle of the night. In different parts of Ireland, the sound was described differently. In Ulster, in the north, the Banshee's cry was said to be the harshest and most alarming, a shriek that could be heard for miles, that would send dogs howling and horses stamping in their stalls, that would wake every person in the house from the deepest sleep with their heart hammering and their hands cold. In Munster, in the south, accounts of the sound were often more gentle, a sustained, low, haunting wail, like someone singing a song of such profound sadness that it had moved past melody into something purer. In Connaught, in the west, where the Atlantic is closest and the landscape is most wild and most exposed, the sound was described as indistinguishable from the wind itself, until you listened long enough to realize that the wind did not form words, did not have the specific contour of anguish, did not circle back and repeat itself in the patterns of a lament. There is something in this that reaches across the centuries and catches in the throat. The name. The one irreducible thing each person has that belongs only to them. To hear the Banshee say your name is to understand that you are known. That even in your dying, you are not unknown. That someone, something, is there in the darkness, weeping for you by name, so that your passage from this world to the next is witnessed and mourned and remembered. Whether that is a terrible thing or a comforting thing may depend on the night, and on your relationship with the dark. Part 5: The Great Families and Their Banshees. The Banshee, as we have said, was in the oldest layers of the tradition a spirit attached to specific noble families of ancient Irish lineage. She was the ancestral mourner of those families, present at their great moments of loss as surely as the family name itself was present. She was not sent to them from outside, she was, in some sense, part of them. Part of the accumulated history and fate and sorrow of everything the family had ever been. Let us speak of some of these great families, and the stories of the banshees who mourned their dead across the centuries. The O'Brien family, the O'Briens, were the descendants of Brian Boru, the High King of Ireland who was killed at the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. Brian Boru is one of the most extraordinary figures in Irish history, a man who rose from the obscurity of a minor Munster clan to unite much of Ireland under his leadership at a time of devastating Viking incursion. He was old when he fought at Clontarf, in his 60s or 70s, a remarkable age for a man of his era, and tradition holds that he knew before the battle began that he would not survive it. He went into it anyway. He went into it because a king did not abandon his people in their hour of greatest need, even when he knew what the cost would be. The Battle of Clontarf was the largest and most violent battle in early Irish history, a great clash of armies at the edge of Dublin Bay on the morning of Good Friday, 1014, in which Brian's forces defeated the Viking and Leinster alliance but at enormous cost. Brian himself was killed in his tent at the end of the battle, when most of the fighting was over, by a fleeing Viking leader named Broder who found him at prayer. One of the most haunting stories from the O'Neill tradition concerns the night before the death of Owen Roe O'Neill in 1649. Owen Roe was the great Ulster general, the brilliant and inspiring military leader who had returned from the Spanish Netherlands to lead the Irish Catholic resistance during the years of the Confederate Ireland. He had won the remarkable victory of Benbub in 1646, routing a much larger Scottish and Ulster Protestant army in what should have been a turning point in the Irish struggle for survival. But then, 3 years later, just as he was preparing to march his army south to resist Cromwell's brutal campaign, Owen Roe sickened and died suddenly, of illness, though some suspected poison. The night before he died, it is said, the Banshee was heard at his camp. Those who were keeping watch in the darkness heard it begin, that low, terrible sound, building slowly from the direction of the river, circling the camp as if acknowledging every soul within it before coming to rest outside the general's tent. The men did not sleep. The horses were restless. And in the morning, Owen Roe could not rise from his bed, and within hours he was gone. The O'Connor family, the O'Connors of Connaught, were another ancient line with a long association with the Banshee tradition. They traced their ancestry to the ancient kings of Connaught and had a banshee described in the tradition as particularly sorrowful in appearance, as if she bore the weight of all the losses of that family, and there had been many, across the long centuries of Irish history. The Connaught tradition describes her sometimes as wearing a mantle of green, moving along the lakeshore in the still hours before dawn, her reflection wavering in the dark water as she walks and weeps. The Fitzgerald family, Norman in origin but deeply Irish in identity after centuries on Irish soil, also had their own banshee. The Fitzgeralds, the great lords of Leinster and Munster, the Earls of Kildare and later the Earls of Desmond, were among the most powerful magnates in medieval Ireland. Their banshee was said to appear in the form of a beautiful young woman, washing herself at a stream, who would vanish if you came too close but whose cry, once she had disappeared, would follow you home and linger in the air around the house until the death occurred. And then there is the Kavanagh family of Leinster, who traced their ancestry to the ancient kings of Leinster and who had a tradition of their banshee that is particularly specific and detailed. It was said that the Kavanagh banshee had been seen and heard by multiple members of the family across generations, and that those who had seen her described her with enough consistency to suggest a single presence returning again and again, a woman of middle height, neither young nor old, with dark hair and pale skin and eyes of a color like deep water, wearing a white gown with her feet bare on the wet grass, weeping not in the loud shrieking way of some traditions but in a quiet, sustained way, as if the grief was too old and too large for noise any more, as if it had settled into something that simply was, like the rain. In many of these family traditions, the banshee was understood to be a specific figure, a woman who had once been connected to the family in life, a woman who had died before her time, or who had been wronged, or whose love for the family had been so absolute that even death had not released her from it. She was not an abstraction. She was a person. She had, or had once had, a name. And her continued presence among the living family was both a mark of devotion and a mark of tragedy. She was bound to them by something that neither life nor death had been able to dissolve. In some local traditions, the banshee was even given a specific identity. In certain Munster accounts, she was identified with the figure of Eowyn, one of the fairy queens of Munster, whose love for the mortal world was so great that she had taken on the role of mourner for the families under her care. In others, she was identified with the spirit of a historical woman, a woman who had lived and loved and died within the family's history and who had chosen, or been chosen, to remain. This dimension of the tradition, the idea that the banshee was not a generic supernatural creature but a specific, loyal, intimate presence, is one of the most powerful and most moving aspects of the whole mythology. She was not a harbinger of death in the way that a thunderstorm or an eclipse might be, impersonal, indifferent, having nothing to do with you specifically. She was deeply personal. She was there for you. For your family. She had been there for your great-great-grandmother's death, and your grandfather's death, and she would be there for yours. She knew your name because she had always known your name. She wept for you because she had always been going to weep for you. Part 6, The Washerwoman at the Ford. Among all the forms in which the banshee appeared in Irish and wider Celtic tradition, none is older, none is more strange and beautiful and terrible, than the figure of the washerwoman at the ford. She was called, in the Old Irish, Bean na Habhin, woman of the river, or simply the washer. She appeared at river crossings, at fords, those shallow places where the water ran clear over stones and where, in the ancient world, you crossed from one territory to another, from one side of the landscape to the other. The ford was a liminal place. A threshold place. A place where you were neither here nor there, balanced over moving water, your feet uncertain on the slippery stones. And at this threshold, in the hours of darkness or in the gray half-light before dawn, she could sometimes be found. She would be kneeling at the water's edge, bent over her work. And her work was this, washing. Washing clothes, washing armor, washing the things that belonged to those who were about to die. She washed them in the dark water, and the water ran red around her hands, and the garments she washed were already stained with blood, blood that had not yet been spilled, blood from wounds that had not yet been dealt. She was washing the aftermath of something that had not yet happened. To see her was to know. If you recognized the garments she was washing, if you saw your own cloak, your own sword belt, your own linen, there was nothing to be done. The fact of your death was already settled in the logic of the world, and the washerwoman at the ford was simply doing what she had always done, making the knowledge visible, in case you wished to know. In case knowing mattered to you. In case there was something you wanted to say, or do, or be, in the time that remained. This figure appears in the Ulster cycle, one of the great bodies of Irish mythology centered on the heroes of the province of Ulster, and most particularly on Cuchulainn, who is perhaps the greatest of all Irish mythological heroes. The Ulster cycle contains some of the most vivid, most violent, most psychologically complex storytelling in all of world mythology, and at its heart is the figure of Cuchulainn, the Hound of Cuillin, the champion of Ulster, whose life burned with such extraordinary intensity that it could not last long. Cuchulainn was the son of the god Lugh, though his earthly father was Sualtam mac Roich, and from his earliest childhood he was marked by destiny. As a small boy he single-handedly killed the great watchdog of the smith Cuillin, and then, rather than leave the smith without protection, pledged himself to serve as the dog in the animal's place until a replacement could be trained. It was from this pledge that he received his name, Cuchulainn, the Hound of Cuillin. As a young man, Cuchulainn was possessed of both extraordinary beauty and extraordinary ferocity. In battle, he underwent the ryostrad, the warp spasm, a transformation so terrible and so total that the man disappeared entirely and what remained was something beyond human understanding, a creature of pure violent force, his body distorting grotesquely, one eye sinking into his skull and the other pushing outward until it was the size of a cauldron, his limbs twisting and relocating, heat radiating from his body in waves. When he came back from the ryostrad, he had to be plunged into cold water 3 times to return him to himself, the first 2 tubs boiling away in clouds of steam from the heat still in him. This was the hero who met the washerwoman at the ford in the story of his death. On the morning of the last day of his life, Cuchulainn set out to battle despite every warning, despite every omen. He had been bound by his Gisa, his sacred prohibitions, the taboos that governed his behavior, and his enemies had contrived circumstances that forced him to break those prohibitions one by one, weakening him through honor rather than through force. He was, by the morning of his final battle, already moving through the world under the shadow of his own ending. As he made his way to the battlefield, he came to a ford. And at the ford, kneeling at the water's edge, was a young woman, washing. She was beautiful in the way that the women of the other world were beautiful, too perfect, too still, with an air of knowing that no mortal woman could quite achieve. And she was washing garments in the river. Garments that Cuchulainn recognized as his own. His companions urged him not to look. Not to ask. Not to engage with what they all understood was happening at the edge of that dark water. But Cuchulainn was not a man who looked away from things, however terrible. He had never looked away from anything in his life. He stopped and he looked, and the woman at the ford looked back at him, and in her eyes was everything he needed to know. He rode on to the battle. He fought. And before the day was over, Cuchulainn, the greatest warrior Ireland had ever produced, was dead. The washerwoman at the ford was, in this context, the Bab, the crow goddess, the battle goddess of the Morrigan's triple form, acting in one of her most ancient and most terrible capacities. She was not killing Cuchulainn. She was witnessing him. She was acknowledging that his death was already woven into the fabric of things, that the threads had been arranged in this particular pattern before the day began, and that all that remained was the moving of the threads into their final position. There is a related tradition in Scotland, the bean nigh, the washing woman, which follows the same basic pattern. The Scottish bean nigh was said to be the spirit of a woman who had died in childbirth, who was condemned to wash the bloodied shrouds of those about to die until the day when her natural lifespan would have run out. If you could catch her, creeping up to her from behind while she was bent over her work, placing yourself between her and the water so she could not escape, you could ask her 3 wishes, and she was obliged to grant them. But she was also allowed 3 wishes in return, and those who were unwise in their dealings with her sometimes found that her wishes undid the advantage their own had given them. The thread connecting the Scottish and Irish traditions here is an ancient one, woven from the shared cultural heritage of the Gaelic peoples on both sides of the narrow sea. The islands and peninsulas of western Scotland were settled by Irish Gaels from at least the 5th century onward, and the cultural exchange between the two territories, in language, in music, in mythology, was continuous and deep. The Bean City of Ireland and the Bean Nigh of Scotland are sisters, daughters of the same ancient feminine figure who stands at the threshold of death and witnesses it. This connection reminds us that the Banshee is not a specifically Irish peculiarity, a local superstition born of a particularly imaginative people. She is, in her deeper dimensions, a universal archetype, the feminine divine face of death, the mourning presence, the one who knows. She appears in different forms in many traditions. The Greek fates, spinning and measuring and cutting the thread of life. The Norse Valkyries, choosing the slain on the battlefield. The Hindu goddess Kali, whose terrifying aspect is simply the ultimate truth of impermanence made visible. The Mexican La Llorona, the weeping woman, whose cry in the night is a warning and a lament. Everywhere that human beings have tried to make sense of death, they have imagined a feminine presence at the threshold. Everywhere that grief has been given a mythological shape, that shape has been a woman weeping. Ireland's particular genius was to make this figure intimate rather than universal. To bring her close. To make her not death itself but death's witness. Not the executioner but the mourner. The one who weeps so that the dying know they are not alone. Part 7, The Morrigan and the Shape of Fate. We spoke earlier of the Morrigan, that great and terrible queen of Irish mythology, and we must return to her now, because to understand the Banshee fully, one must stand in the shadow of the Morrigan and feel the full reach of her mythology. The Morrigan is one of the most formidable figures in all of world mythology. She is not easy to approach. She does not simplify herself. She refuses the categories we might try to place her in. She is not simply a goddess of death, not simply a goddess of war, not simply a goddess of fate. She is all of these things at once, and something more as well. Something that the available words do not quite capture. She is the principle of necessity. The force that makes it so that things must happen as they must happen, that the shape of a person's fate is ultimately fixed, that all the hero's strength and courage and love cannot change the fundamental fact of his mortality. She is not cruel. She is not indifferent. She is honest. She is the most honest presence in all of Irish mythology, because she sees the truth of things and does not pretend otherwise. The Morrigan's most extended appearance in the surviving mythological texts is in the great prose epic called Tainbua Quailnge, the cattle raid of Cooley, and in the related mythological texts of the Ulster cycle. She appears to Cuchulainn repeatedly, and their relationship is one of the most complex and fascinating in all of Irish literature. She first approaches him in the guise of a beautiful young woman, the daughter of a great king, offering him her love and her power. Cuchulainn refuses her. He says, with a kind of terrible, tragic self-containment that is completely in character, that he has no time for a woman's company, that he is busy with his heroic work. He does not recognize her. He does not understand what he is refusing. The Morrigan is not insulted exactly. She is something more complex than insulted. She is interested. She tells him, in so many words, that he will regret this. Not as a curse, though it sounds like one, but as a statement of truth. That by refusing the integration of the feminine divine into his heroic self, by refusing the dark knowledge that she carries, he is making himself incomplete. And an incomplete hero, however brilliant, cannot survive. She harasses him through the Táin in a series of encounters, each one testing him, each one offering him the opportunity to understand something he does not want to understand. She attacks him as an eel, tripping him in the ford during his combat with the great warrior Locke. He breaks her ribs. She attacks as a wolf, driving cattle against him. He puts out her eye. She attacks as a heifer, leading a stampede. He breaks her leg. And then comes the most extraordinary episode. Badly wounded, the Morrigan appears to Cuchulainn in the guise of an old woman milking a cow. She is in the triple forms of her wounds, her broken ribs, her missing eye, her broken leg. She offers him 3 squirts of milk, and as he drinks each one and thanks her, as simple courtesy, as a hero's natural gratitude to an old woman who has helped him, each thank you heals one of the wounds he has unknowingly inflicted on her. He blesses her 3 times without knowing it. She heals 3 times without acknowledging what she is. And the transaction is completed between them, not the one she offered at the beginning, not the full union of the heroic and the divine feminine, but something smaller, something partial. Something that preserved his life for a while longer but could not, in the end, save it. This is the shape of the Morrigan's relationship with human heroes. She approaches them. She offers them the fullness of fate's knowledge. They refuse, or they accept incompletely, or they accept without understanding what they are accepting. And she withdraws, not in anger, but in a kind of sorrow, and waits. She waits for the battle at the ford, for the morning that comes with all its weight of inevitability, for the moment when the hero will finally know what she has always known. On the day of Cuchulainn's death, after he is mortally wounded, he ties himself to a standing stone so that he may die on his feet. He remains standing for hours after death has entered him, because he was that kind of man, because he would not give his enemies the sight of him falling. And only when the Morrigan lands on his shoulder in the form of a crow, only when she comes to rest on him at last, as she has always been going to rest on him, do his enemies know that he is dead. The crow on the shoulder of the dead hero. The final acknowledgement. The Morrigan is not weeping at this moment. She is something beyond weeping. But the Bab, her keening aspect, is weeping elsewhere, has been weeping for some time, and the sound of that weeping has been heard across Ulster before the battle was over. There is something in the Morrigan story that also addresses a question that haunts all Banshee tradition, the question of whether the Banshee causes the death she mourns, or simply knows about it. The answer that the mythology gives, again and again, is clearly the latter. The Morrigan does not kill. She knows. The Banshee does not kill. She mourns. The knowledge of death is not the same as the causing of death. The announcement of an ending is not the same as the creation of that ending. The Banshee does not come for you because she wants you to die. She comes because she already knows you are going to. And she comes weeping because she wishes it were otherwise. This distinction matters enormously. It transforms the Banshee from a figure of dread into a figure of profound compassion. She is not your enemy. She is the only being in the universe that will grieve your specific death before it happens, will honor your specific existence with the full force of her sorrow before you have even taken your last breath. She is the sound of being known, of being mourned, of mattering. Part 8: The Banshee in Medieval and Early Modern Ireland. The coming of Christianity to Ireland in the 5th century did not erase the mythological world that had existed before it. Ireland's conversion was, by the standards of the time, remarkably peaceful. There are no mass martyrdoms, no great battles between the new faith and the old, no systematic destruction of the sacred sites and sacred stories that had defined Irish life for millennia. Instead, what happened was something much more subtle and much more interesting, a gradual weaving together of the old and the new, a negotiation between the pre-Christian spiritual world and the Christian one that produced something entirely unique to Ireland. Saint Patrick, who came to Ireland in the 5th century and whose legend has overgrown the historical figure almost completely, was, according to the later accounts, confronted with the old stories and chose to engage with them rather than simply condemn them. The text called a Galam na Sinarach, the colloquy of the old men, imagines the great Fenian hero Cailt Mac Ronayne surviving into the age of St. Patrick and telling him the old stories as they travel together across the landscape of Ireland. And Patrick listens. He weighs the stories and finds them beautiful, and he commands his scribes to write them down, so that Ireland's heritage will not be lost. This is, of course, a literary conceit, a way of validating the preservation of the old stories within a Christian framework. But the attitude it encodes is real. The Irish monks who copied and preserved the mythological texts were not doing it against their faith, they were doing it as an expression of their faith in the richness and complexity of God's creation, which included the ancient stories of their people. The Banshee, in this transitional period, was accommodated into a Christian framework with remarkable ease, because she did not threaten the fundamental tenets of the new faith. She did not claim to be a god. She did not ask for worship. She asked only to be acknowledged, to be heard, to be understood as a real presence in the world. The Church could fold her into the category of spirit, a supernatural being, certainly, but one whose existence did not contradict the existence of God or the saints. She became part of the folklore that existed alongside faith rather than against it. In the medieval period, the long centuries between the consolidation of Christianity in Ireland and the catastrophic disruptions of the 16th and 17th centuries, the Banshee tradition continued to evolve and deepen within a culture that was vigorously literate, deeply poetic, and profoundly interested in the relationship between the visible and the invisible worlds. The bardic tradition of medieval Ireland, the professional poets, the Fillid, who occupied a position of extraordinary power and prestige in Irish society, was intimately connected to the mythological tradition and to the themes of fate, death, and the supernatural feminine. The Fillid were not merely entertainers. They were keepers of genealogy, of history, of the sacred narratives that defined who the Irish people were. Their poetry was understood to have real power, power to bless and to curse, power to preserve and to destroy, power to reach into the invisible world and bring back what was needed. The bardic lament, the elegy composed for a dead lord or hero, was one of the most important and most demanding forms in the whole tradition. These laments were expected to be artistically brilliant and also ritually correct, combining genuine grief with the formal knowledge of mythological precedent, calling on the tradition of the divine keeners, invoking the memory of those who had wept before, locating the specific death within the larger narrative of Irish mortality. Eileen did not literally become a banshee in composing this poem. But she became a keener in the most ancient and most sacred sense. She gave Ard O'Leary's death the acknowledgement it deserved. She named his wounds, his horse, his love. She said his name again and again in the poem, holding him in the sound of language against the silence of death. And she transformed her personal grief into something universal, into a sound that has been moving through the Irish world ever since, recognized by everyone who hears it as true. This is what the banshee represents in the deepest sense, not a supernatural threat, not a portent of doom, but a model of how to grieve. A divine exemplar of the necessity and the dignity of mourning. A reminder that loss is not something to be overcome quickly or buried under activity or numbed into silence. Loss is something to be wept, loudly, specifically, by name, until the weeping has done what it needs to do. The 16th and 17th centuries brought catastrophe to Ireland on a scale that was almost beyond the capacity of the mythological tradition to absorb. The Elizabethan and Cromwellian conquests, the destruction of the Old Gaelic order, the plantation of Ulster with English and Scottish settlers, the penal laws, these were not simply political events. They were cultural catastrophes, the dismantling of a whole civilization, the suppression of a language and a body of knowledge and a way of being in the world that had survived for thousands of years. In the years after the flight of the Earls in 1607, when the last great Gaelic lords of Ulster fled to the continent, their cause lost, their world ending, the Banshee tradition underwent a significant change. She was no longer primarily associated with the great noble families in their seats of power, in their stone castles and their defended halls. Those families were gone, scattered to France and Spain, dead or dispossessed. The tradition dispersed. It came down from the great houses and settled into the ordinary people, into the farming families and the fishing families, into the people who kept the Irish language and the Irish stories alive in their cottages and their townlands through the centuries of oppression. And in this dispersal, the Banshee became something slightly different, still recognizably herself, still the ancestral mourner of Irish lineages, but now also a more intimate, more personal presence. She was not only for the great families anymore. She was for everyone who carried Irish blood and Irish grief, which after the 17th century was nearly everyone on the island. Part 9. The Banshee in Folklore and Living Tradition. The great collectors of Irish folklore in the 19th century found the Banshee not as a fading relic of a superseded past but as a living, vivid, actively believed presence in the Irish world. People had heard her. Or their grandparents had heard her. Or their neighbors had, last winter, and had known before morning which house would have a death that week. Lady Wilde, whom we have already mentioned, collected numerous accounts in the second half of the 19th century. Her work, Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland, published in 1887, is a treasure of the tradition, written with both scholarly attention and genuine literary sympathy. Lady Wilde was not a woman who condescended to the beliefs she collected. She understood their depth. She had, perhaps, a keener sense than many of her contemporaries of what was being lost as the 19th century dragged on and the modern world pressed harder against the ancient one. One account she preserves involves a family in County Clare who heard the Banshee 3 nights running before the death of the father of the house. The sound, described by the family's eldest daughter, was like nothing she had heard before or since. It was not quite human weeping, because human weeping, however deep, always had the sound of a throat and a chest and a body behind it. This sound was larger than that. It was as if the air itself was weeping, as if the grief had permeated the atmosphere and everything in it had become saturated with sorrow. The first night they thought it was an animal, or the wind in the chimney. The second night they knew. The third night the father died before morning. Another account from the Munster tradition involves a man who saw the Banshee, actually saw her, sitting on the wall of the churchyard at dusk. She was a woman in white, slight and still, her head bowed, and from where he stood he could hear her crying quietly, the kind of crying that has gone past the stage of effort and has become simply continuous, the sound of grief that has been happening long enough to have its own rhythm, its own settled acceptance of itself. He stood and watched her for several minutes. She did not look up. And when he moved closer, curiosity being stronger than fear in some natures, she vanished. Simply was no longer there. And 3 days later his mother died. The Ordnance Survey letters, compiled by John O'Donovan and Eugene Okery in the 1830s as part of the Great Mapping Survey of Ireland, contain dozens of references to Banshee traditions in different parts of the country, gathered from the local people who were interviewed as part of the survey. These are particularly valuable because they were collected before the Great Famine of the 1840s, which would destroy so much of the living culture of rural Ireland, and because they were gathered systematically across the whole island, giving a picture of the tradition in its full geographic spread. The accounts from Connaught, the west of Ireland, the province that the ancient mythological tradition most closely associates with the otherworld and with the threshold between the living and the dead, are among the most vivid. In County Galway and County Mayo, the Banshee tradition was particularly strong and particularly detailed. She appeared, in the Connaught accounts, more often near water than in any other setting, near lakes, near rivers, near the sea. This connects her to the ancient Celtic tradition of water as a boundary between the worlds, of rivers and pools as places where the membrane between this world and the next was permeable. Offerings were thrown into water. Sacred objects were deposited in bogs and rivers. The dead were sometimes laid near water. The otherworld lay beneath the water as much as it lay beneath the hills. The Connaught accounts also preserve a striking detail about the Banshee's movement. She did not simply appear in one place. She moved. She circled. She would be heard first at a distance, across the valley, across the field, and then closer still, until she was just outside the house, just beyond the door, weeping in the darkness with her face almost touching the wall. And then, gradually, she would move away again. The sound diminishing in the darkness as she retreated back to wherever she had come from, leaving the night silent except for the breathing of the family inside, who lay awake in their beds knowing what the morning would bring. The intimacy of this image, the supernatural mourner pressing close to the human house, separated from the living by nothing more than a wooden door or a stone wall, is one of the most powerful in all the tradition. She is so close, and yet entirely unreachable. The boundary between her world and ours is so thin, and yet it holds. She cannot enter. She does not enter. She simply remains outside, weeping, acknowledging, bearing witness, until the time has come. There are also a striking number of accounts from the Irish diaspora, from Irish communities in America, in Australia, in England, where the Banshee tradition survived the crossing of the ocean. Continue from where the previous script left off, starting mid-part 9, and write all remaining sections in full without repeating anything already written. This is perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of the whole tradition. The Banshee crossed the Atlantic. She followed the Irish to the New World. In the decades following the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, that catastrophic failure of the potato crop that killed perhaps 1 million people and drove another 1.5 million to emigrate in a few terrible years, the Irish diaspora became one of the largest and most widely distributed in the world. They went to Boston and New York and Philadelphia and Chicago. They went to Melbourne and Sydney. They went to Liverpool and London and Glasgow. They carried almost nothing with them, they had nothing to carry. But they carried their stories. And among those stories, packed into the hold of the coffin ships alongside the grief and the hunger and the fury and the hope, the Banshee came too. And there was something both heartbreaking and beautiful in this persistence. The Banshee did not abandon the Irish when they were driven from their land. She went with them. She found them in the New World, in the unfamiliar cities, and she continued to do what she had always done. She came ahead of death to weep, to announce, to acknowledge, to ensure that the dying would not pass unnoticed into whatever came next. She did not wake her family. There was nothing to be done. She lay still and she listened, and she let the sound enter her as it had always entered the Irish, not with terror but with a kind of enormous sadness, the sadness of recognition, the sadness of knowing that the world was about to become slightly smaller, slightly emptier. Before morning, her youngest son was dead of fever. Part 10, Encounters, Legends, and the Living Tradition. The tradition of the Banshee is not confined to the ancient texts or the folklore collections of the 19th century. It persisted, stubbornly and vitally, into the 20th century and beyond. People continued to report hearing her. People continued to believe in her. And perhaps more importantly, people continued to feel the need of her. The need for some acknowledgement that death is not merely a medical event, not merely a cessation of biological processes, but something larger and more significant, something worthy of supernatural grief. Let us spend time now with some of the most detailed and most resonant legends and encounters that the tradition has preserved, because it is in the specific stories, the particular places, the particular nights, the particular sounds, that the Banshee comes most fully alive. There is the story of the Rossmore family, an Anglo-Irish family who had settled in County Monaghan and who, despite their English origins, had been on Irish soil long enough to acquire the protections and the burdens of the old traditions. Lord Rossmore, according to an account preserved in the memoirs of the period, died in 1807 under circumstances that those present found difficult to explain in purely rational terms. Barrington rose and went to the window. He could see nothing in the darkness outside. The sound continued for some minutes and then ceased. In the morning, they discovered that Lord Rossmore had died in the night, at approximately the hour when the sound had been heard. Barrington, a rational man of the Enlightenment tradition, found himself unable to dismiss what he had heard. He recorded it carefully and honestly, noting that he could not explain it, that it did not fit any category of natural phenomenon he was aware of, and that those who had also heard it in the house, servants, other guests, were unanimous in their identification of the sound as the Banshee's cry. This account is significant partly because of who preserved it. Sir Jonah Barrington was not a credulous peasant in a remote cottage. He was an educated, legally trained, sophisticated member of the Anglo-Irish establishment. His willingness to record the experience without dismissing it, his honesty about his own inability to explain it, gives the account a particular weight that purely folkloric collections sometimes lack. There is also the tradition preserved in County Kerry, in the extreme southwest of Ireland, where the mountains come down almost to the sea and the landscape retains a wildness and a remoteness that seems to encourage the survival of old beliefs. The Kerry tradition of the Banshee is particularly rich, perhaps because the area was one of the last strongholds of the Irish language and the oral tradition that language carried. In the Kerry tradition, the Banshee was sometimes called the Bean Caoint, the keening woman, rather than the Bean Sidhe, emphasizing her role as mourner over her nature as an otherworldly being. This small linguistic difference carries a significant shift of emphasis. She is defined by what she does rather than by where she comes from. She is the one who keens. The one whose function in the world is grief. Kerry accounts from the late 19th and early 20th centuries describe her as appearing particularly near mountain streams and near the ancient standing stones that dot the landscape of the peninsula. The standing stones, some of them dating to the Bronze Age, 3,000 or 4,000 years old, still upright in the fields and on the hillsides, were understood to mark the boundary between the ordinary world and the otherworld, and the Banshee moved between these markers in the darkness, using the ancient map of sacred geography that had been laid out long before the first human memory. One account involves a young farmer who was returning home late one evening along a barreen, a narrow country lane, in the hills above Dingle. He heard the sound first as he came over the crest of the hill, a sustained, low wailing that seemed to come from the direction of a cluster of standing stones in the field below. He stopped his horse, because the horse had already stopped itself, its ears flat and its body rigid with the particular tension of an animal that has perceived something its rider has not yet fully understood. He rode home quickly. And within the week, his father, who had been ill but not critically so, who had been expected to recover, died quietly in his sleep. There is also the remarkable body of accounts connected to the death of Daniel O'Connell, the great Irish political leader and emancipator who died in Genoa in 1847 on his way to Rome, weakened by imprisonment and ill health. O'Connell was perhaps the most beloved Irishman of his century, the man who had won Catholic emancipation through the sheer power of his oratory and his organizational genius, who had mobilized millions of ordinary Irish people into a peaceable political force of extraordinary effectiveness. The political dimension of this tradition, the Banshee mourning a great political figure as well as a private death, reflects the evolution of the tradition through the centuries of Irish history. As the old noble families declined and dispersed, as the political landscape of Ireland was transformed by conquest and plantation and emancipation and nationalism, the Banshee's constituency broadened. She mourned not just the ancient clan lords but all those whose deaths had significance for the Irish people, all those who were understood to be, in some sense, representatives of Ireland's fate. And this brings us to one of the most striking dimensions of the whole tradition, the Banshee as witness to collective grief. Not just individual deaths but the deaths of a people. The deaths that happen when a culture is destroyed, when a language is suppressed, when the children of a nation are scattered across the world by famine and poverty and despair. If the Banshee was heard before the death of a single man, how many times must she have wept during the famine years? How many nights, in how many townlands, must that sound have been in the air, over and over, too constant to be distinguished from the wind any more, too much a part of the landscape of that time to be separately noticed? Perhaps the silence that descended on the Irish countryside after the famine, the peculiar, well-documented silence of a landscape that had been emptied of half its people, was partly the silence that comes after an enormous and prolonged keening. The silence of a throat that has wept itself empty. The silence after. Part 11, The Banshee in Modern Culture and Her Enduring Meaning. The Banshee has not remained locked in the past, preserved only in folklore collections and mythological texts. She has moved forward through time with remarkable vitality, adapted and reinterpreted by each generation, appearing in literature and music and film and visual art, refusing to be merely historical, refusing to become quaint. In the 19th century, she entered Anglo-Irish and British literature with considerable force. Writers who were drawn to the atmospheric and Gothic possibilities of Irish mythology found in her a figure of extraordinary dramatic potential, a female ghost, a prophetic spirit, a sound in the darkness that carried with it the weight of centuries. She appeared in poetry and in ghost stories and in the increasingly popular genre of Irish romantic fiction that flourished in the mid-19th century. But the literary treatments of the Banshee that deserve most attention are those that took her seriously as a mythological and cultural figure rather than simply as a Gothic device. William Butler Yeats, the great Irish poet who was also one of the most serious students of Irish mythology and folklore in the 19th and 20th centuries, engaged deeply with the tradition of the Irish supernatural, including the Banshee. His collections of folklore, fairy and folk tales of the Irish peasantry, published in 1888, and The Celtic Twilight, published in 1893, contain extensive material about the Banshee and the related traditions of Irish fairy lore. And more importantly, his poetry is saturated with the sensibility that produced the Banshee tradition, the sense of a world in which the living and the dead are not fully separated, in which the beautiful and the terrible are aspects of the same thing, in which grief and love are not opposites but companions. Yeats understood something about the Banshee that more casual interpreters often missed. He understood that she was not a monster. He understood that the Irish tradition of supernatural mourning was not a tradition of fear but a tradition of acknowledgement. He wrote in The Celtic Twilight of the Irish fairy world as being continuous with the human world, interpenetrating it, sharing its joys and its sorrows, participating in its grief. The Banshee, in this understanding, was part of an Irish spiritual ecology, a living system of relationships between the human and the supernatural that sustained both. The poet and playwright J.M. Synge, whose Riders to the Sea is perhaps the most direct theatrical engagement with the Irish tradition of mourning, was also deeply influenced by this understanding. Riders to the Sea, that brief, devastating masterpiece set on the Aran Islands, is essentially a secular enactment of the keening tradition, a modern tragedy that draws its power directly from the ancient ritual of the Na Cawant. The old woman Moria's lament for her sons at the end of the play, her quiet acceptance of the last death in a long series of deaths, carries within it the full weight of everything the Banshee represents, the feminine presence that knows, that endures, that mourns, and that does not break. In the 20th century, the Banshee continued to evolve. In Irish popular culture, she remained a vivid and actively believed presence, or at least a presence that occupied the uncertain territory between active belief and powerful metaphor that folklore inhabits in modern life. People in Ireland continued to report hearing her, continued to identify the experience with approaching deaths in their families. The accounts became part of the texture of Irish life in the same way that the saints and their legends were part of it, neither dismissed nor fully systematized, simply present, simply available as a framework for making sense of the mysterious and the terrible. In the broader cultural world, the Banshee became a symbol of Ireland itself, of Irish grief, Irish memory, Irish connection to the deep past. She appeared on the covers of recordings of traditional Irish music. She was invoked in political speeches as a metaphor for Ireland's long mourning of its history. She appeared in novels and films, sometimes accurately rendered and sometimes distorted into something more monstrous than she actually is. The distortion is worth pausing on, because it reveals something about the cultural pressures that shape how mythological figures are transmitted through time. The Banshee in her Hollywood incarnation, the screaming spirit of death, the terrifying supernatural killer, the monster of horror films, is almost the exact opposite of what the tradition actually describes. She has been transformed from a mourner into a murderer, from a compassionate witness into a predatory threat. This transformation says less about the Banshee than it does about the cultures that made it, cultures in which death is feared and avoided and denied to a degree that makes any figure associated with it automatically monstrous, cultures that have lost the capacity to understand mourning as a sacred act. Because the actual tradition, the Irish tradition, in all its depth and complexity, does not present the Banshee as something to be escaped or defeated. You cannot escape her because she is not pursuing you. You cannot defeat her because she is not your enemy. The appropriate response to the Banshee, in the tradition, is not flight or resistance. It is listening. It is allowing yourself to be present in the sound of her grief. It is understanding that she is weeping for someone you love, and that her weeping is a gift, however terrible, the gift of acknowledgement, of being known, of mattering enough to be mourned by something ancient and enduring. There is a movement in contemporary Ireland and in the Irish diaspora to reclaim the Banshee from the distortions of horror culture, to restore her to her proper mythological context as a figure of power and compassion. This movement is part of a broader Irish cultural recovery of the pre-Christian and the early medieval traditions, a desire to reconnect with the deep roots of Irish identity and spirituality that survived the centuries of colonization and suppression but were not always easily accessible. The harp, too, the national instrument of Ireland, its image carried on the Irish passport and the Irish coin, has ancient connections to the boundary between the living and the dead. Harps were buried with the dead in some ancient traditions. Harpists were understood to be able to play the dead to rest, to provide the music for the soul's journey. A piece of slow harp music, in the right setting, in the right darkness, carries something of the Banshee's quality, the beauty that is inseparable from sorrow, the sound that acknowledges what cannot be changed. Scholars of Irish mythology and Celtic studies have in recent decades done important work in restoring the Banshee to her full mythological context, connecting her explicitly to the sovereignty goddesses, to the keening tradition, to the figure of Bad, to the larger feminine divine of the Irish tradition. This scholarly work is important not merely as academic exercise but as cultural healing, the recovery of a figure who was distorted and diminished by both colonial suppression of Irish culture and modern horror culture's appetite for female monsters, and the restoration of her to her actual nature as one of the most complex, most compassionate, and most deeply human figures in all of world mythology. She is Ireland's gift to the world's understanding of death. And the world, which has never been comfortable with death, which has always tried to find ways to make it smaller or more manageable or less present, could do worse than to sit with this gift for a while and feel its full weight. Part 12, The Eternal Keener, Reflections on Grief, Memory, and the Sacred Feminine. Let us spend this final section simply sitting with her. Understanding her. Allowing the full depth of what she represents to become clear, the way a landscape becomes clear as the mist lifts, slowly, revealing first one feature and then another, until the whole of it is visible and you understand why it is beautiful. The Banshee is, at her most fundamental level, an embodiment of the human truth that love and loss are inseparable. To love anything, a person, a place, a time of life, a version of the world, is to accept the possibility of losing it. To love something mortal is to accept that there will come a moment when that thing is gone, and the love will still be there, with nowhere to go, filling the space where the loved thing used to be with a weight that can feel unbearable. This is grief. And grief, in the Irish tradition as expressed through the Banshee, is not a problem to be solved or a wound to be healed as quickly as possible. It is a reality to be honored. It is the appropriate response to the reality of loss, and to suppress it or rush through it or pretend it is not there is to fail in one's obligation to the person who has died, to deny the significance of their existence by denying the significance of their absence. The Banshee weeps before the death because she understands this truth in its fullest dimension. She understands that by the time the death has occurred, the people who loved the dying person will be too stunned, too raw, too overwhelmed to weep fully. The body will have to be prepared. The arrangements will have to be made. The relatives will have to be notified. The living, out of necessity, will have to continue living, and the weight of all that living will press against the grief and delay it, compress it, defer it. So she weeps first. She weeps before the living must pretend to manage. She weeps the grief in advance, so that it is already in the air, already acknowledged, already begun. There is a therapeutic wisdom in this that modern psychology has only recently begun to articulate. The concept of anticipatory grief, the grief that begins before a loss has occurred, when the loss is known to be coming, is understood in contemporary psychology as a real and significant form of mourning. It is not morbid. It is not pessimistic. It is the psyche's attempt to begin the enormous work of adjustment before the blow falls, to prepare itself for what is coming, to give grief its space before the space disappears in the chaos of the immediate aftermath. The Banshee is the mythological embodiment of this principle. She begins the grief before it is necessary to perform the grief. She holds the space open. She says, "Here is what is coming. Let yourself feel the first edge of it. Let the sound of it into your body now, while you can still breathe, while you can still stand. You will need to have already begun by the time it happens. Let me help you begin. This is not cruelty. This is the deepest kind of compassion. There is also something important to be said about the specifically feminine nature of this figure and what it reveals about the Irish mythological tradition's understanding of the feminine divine. In many world traditions, death is masculine. The Grim Reaper is male. The god of the underworld, Hades, Osiris, Yama, Mictlantecuhtli, is typically male. Death comes as a man, sometimes as an old man, sometimes as a warrior, sometimes as a judge. And the appropriate response, in these traditions, is heroic resistance, the hero who fights death, the hero who travels to the underworld to bargain for the return of the beloved, the hero who ultimately fails but who achieves dignity and meaning through the quality of his resistance. Ireland's mythological tradition does something different. In the Irish understanding, the relationship with death is not primarily one of resistance. It is one of relationship. Death is not your opponent. It is your fate, which is also to say, it is your completion, the full shape of your life, visible only when it is finished. And the appropriate response to fate is not heroic resistance but something more complex, acknowledgement, grief, the willingness to feel the full weight of what is happening, and then the continuation of life, changed and diminished but enduring. This is a feminine understanding of death, feminine not in the sense of gender, but in the sense of the particular spiritual orientation that the Irish tradition associated with the feminine divine, the orientation toward relationship, toward the earth, toward cycles and seasons, toward the long continuity of things rather than the brief brilliant individual. The Banshee is feminine because grief is the appropriate response to loss, and the Irish tradition recognized grief as a fundamentally relational act, an act that acknowledges the connection between the grieving and the grieved, that insists on the importance of that connection even after death has severed it in the physical world. To grieve is to insist that the connection was real. To grieve is to refuse to pretend that the lost person or thing was not important. To grieve is, in its own way, a declaration of love. The Banshee makes this declaration on behalf of everyone who cannot make it themselves. She is the grief we cannot feel yet. She is the love we cannot yet express as grief. She is the sound of the universe acknowledging that something irreplaceable is passing, that the world is slightly smaller after every death, that the particular pattern of this specific person will never be arranged again in all of time. There is a passage in the old Irish mythology that I want to sit with for a moment. It comes from the story of the Battle of Mag Tuired, the great battle between the Tuatha Dé Danann and their adversaries, in which the Morrigan plays a central role. After the battle is won, the Morrigan speaks a prophecy, not a prophecy of doom, as she sometimes does, but something stranger and more ambiguous, a vision of the far future that encompasses both triumph and decay, both the heights of human possibility and the depths of human failure. And at the end of this vision, what comes through most powerfully is not triumph or defeat but something simpler, the endurance of the earth itself, the continuity of the land beneath all the human turbulence, the persistence of something that cannot be killed because it was never quite alive in the human sense, only present, only witnessing, only remembering. The Banshee is part of that presence. She is the part of Ireland that remembers everything. That has witnessed every death on this island since the first human death, has heard every name, has wept every loss, has kept the record of all that was and is no longer. She is the land's memory of its people. She is the other world's love for the human world, expressed in the only way that ancient and enduring things can express love, with the full acknowledgement of mortality, the full weight of knowing that what is beautiful is also brief, that what is precious is also fragile, that what is loved will eventually be lost. And yet, she keeps coming. She keeps weeping. After 10,000 years of Irish deaths, after every plague and battle and famine and diaspora and drowning and ordinary quiet passing in the night, she is still there. Still circling the house in the darkness. Still pressing her sorrow against the wall outside the window. Still saying the name. That persistence is its own kind of answer to the question of death. Not the Christian answer, not the rationalist answer, but something older and stranger and in its own way more comforting. The answer that the Irish landscape itself seems to give, if you sit in it long enough and listen carefully enough. The answer that comes from the standing stones and the fairy mounds and the dark water of the bog pools where the ancient dead sleep. The answer is this: you will be mourned. You will be remembered. Someone, something, will know that you were here. Your name will be said in the darkness after you are gone. The love that was given to you and the love that you gave will not simply evaporate when your body fails. It will go somewhere. It will become part of the accumulated sorrow and tenderness of the other world, carried by the one who has always carried it, the one who stands between this world and the next and refuses to let either world forget the other. You will be mourned. And in the mythological logic of the Banshee, that means you will not be forgotten. And to not be forgotten is, in its own way, a form of survival. There is a phrase in the Irish tradition, Tír gan tina, Tír gan anam, a land without language is a land without a soul. The Irish understood that to lose the language was to lose the memory, and to lose the memory was to lose the self. They fought for their language across centuries of suppression because they understood this, that the words carried the stories, and the stories carried the people, and the people, living and dead, were carried in the stories. The Banshee is part of this language. She is one of the words that the Irish used to describe the world. One of the old, deep words whose root goes all the way down to the beginning of the culture. And as long as she is spoken of, as long as her name is known and her story is told, she continues to do what she has always done. She continues to stand at the boundary. She continues to weep. She continues to acknowledge that death is real, and that love is real, and that the distance between them is the distance between a sound and its echo, which is to say, no distance at all. Let us stay here for a moment in the quiet of that understanding. Let the image of her settle in you. Not the Hollywood version, not the screaming monster, not the thing to be feared. The real one. The ancient one. The woman on the hillside in the gray light before dawn, her hair loose, her feet wet with the morning dew, weeping quietly for someone she loves, for someone she has always loved, for someone who is about to cross the threshold she has been guarding since the beginning of things. She is weeping so that you do not have to weep alone. She is weeping so that the world knows. She is weeping because you matter. Because you have always mattered. Because the particular, unrepeatable, extraordinary accident of your existence, here, now, in this body, in this time, with these loves and these griefs and these small moments of beauty that no one else has seen in quite the same way, all of that matters to something older and larger than you can imagine. Something that has been watching the human world with love and sorrow since before the first story was told. She is not coming for you tonight. Tonight, she is simply in the background of the world, as she always is, as she always has been, the low, sustained note beneath the melody of living, the undertone of everything. The reminder that you are loved by the land you came from. That even in your dying, you will not be alone. Rest in that now. Let the story settle around you like the earth around a sleeping seed. Closing meditation. You are lying still now. Your breath is slow and even. The story has moved through you like water moves through limestone, leaving its shape in you, carving its meaning into you gently, without effort, while you rest. The hills of Ireland are very far away tonight. But they are also, in some sense that the mythology understands even if the map does not, very close. The old stories are always close. The old presences are always near. The other world does not go away when we stop looking for it. The Banshee is not here for you tonight. She is somewhere on a hillside in the west, in the gray-green darkness, doing what she has always done, keeping her ancient vigil at the edge of the human world. You are safe. You are here. You are held in the ordinary beauty of your own existence, which is extraordinary, which has always been extraordinary, which the universe has been quietly acknowledging since the moment you arrived in it. Let your body grow heavy now. Let the weight of the day, and the weight of the story, press you gently down into rest. Your breath moves in and out without effort. Your heart beats its patient, faithful rhythm. The darkness behind your eyes is soft and complete. Think for a moment, if you like, of the people you love. Let their faces pass through the quiet of your mind like light through deep water. Know that they are known. That they are held in something larger than your love alone. That the world has been counting its beloved since before anyone could count. That every name will be remembered. That every light that passes leaves a warmth in the place where it burned. You are part of that great continuity. You are part of the long Irish memory, even if not a drop of Irish blood runs in you, because the Banshee's truth is not only Ireland's truth. It belongs to everyone who has ever loved something mortal. It belongs to everyone who has ever stood at the edge of loss and felt the enormity of it. It belongs to everyone who has ever, in the small hours of the night, heard something in the wind that might have been grief, or might have been love, or might have been both at once because they were always the same sound. Sleep now. Let the story hold you. Let the hillside in your mind grow quiet, the dew settle on the grass, the gray light before dawn give way slowly, slowly, to the deeper darkness that is not the end of things but the rest between them. The Banshee knows your name. And she is weeping tonight for someone else. Rest. If you're still awake, just breathe slowly and let the ancient stories drift with you. Subscribe to Mythology for sleep for a new legend every week. Sweet dreams.